Evening, wherever you may be listening to us from here on this beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions, where we just like to dig a little deeper, inform people, and kind of get out of that crazy paradigm that we call the mainstream corporate media. So, you won't hear so much about sports and celebrity gossip here. Instead, I try to get into a lot of things that normally you don't run across. And what I'd like to deal with in this show is the issue of slavery. Now, I'm going to take this a little bit differently than you're probably used to. I think we're all really aware of the kind of horrible institution of slavery that existed in the United States up until 1865. I mean, taking people and forcing them to do work against their will, to see family members sold off and stuff, absolutely despicable. There's no excuse for it. The thing is that a lot of times we don't realize that slavery extended beyond American shores. I remember I was listening to a class one time, and the instructor was talking about the issue of American slavery. And a young woman raised her hand and said, "Why is it that Americans are so evil? Why have we done so much evil?" The instructor, who I guess was not all, totally to the left, the instructor actually said, "Well, wait a minute. Let's take a look. Can you find a society that has not practiced slavery, that has not forced people into involuntary servitude?" And what was interesting was, the class was quiet, and because they realized that when you actually look at it, slavery has been around for a long time. It's been practiced by pretty much every culture. I'm not talking about every single down to the some little tribe out in the Amazon, but every significant culture, it seems, once it gets civilization, irony, huh? Once it gets civilization, it starts exploiting other people. I remember the movie, I'm going to bring up a lot of movie examples here maybe, but the movie Apocalypto. You had a situation where you had this small tribe of people just surviving out in the Amazon, or whichever jungles it was in Central America or whatever. And the thing is, many of them get killed, and the survivors are drug off to be sacrificed on the pyramids. I think it was the Inca that were being presented, or the Maya, one of the two. It doesn't make any difference, really. But the thing is that you had a contrast there between a small, peaceful society and what happens when you have a very, very advanced society with an immense infrastructure and power system. They start picking on the people who do not have that kind of power system. Now, the thing is that Europe, I think a lot of people have a very myopic view. They feel that Europe has always been kind of this dominant force, and they don't actually understand that Europe is a relatively recent comer to the game. It's we could look at the Roman Empire and the Greeks, but the rest of Europe was pretty much primitive compared to civilizations that were flourishing in Mesoamerica, in Asia, and in North Africa and the Middle East. And you got a power differentiation that really did make a huge difference. Now, let's take a look at something here. I'm just looking at, and I'm going to talk more about this whole European slave situation. One of the reasons why I have an interest in this, I did a little bit of research on it, obviously. My book, my fourth book in the Freedom from Conscience series, freedom from conscience, descent into darkness, actually talks about slavery and deals with the fact that even in Portland, Oregon, during the 1800s, you had situations where, and you can check your history books on this, a lot of young men were shanghaied. Look at the origins of that term, into forced service on boats. But a lot of young women were also captured and sold into slavery. And, the thing is that this is something that has existed throughout the ages in a lot of different places. So we should look into that. Now, but I'm going to go back a little bit in time here and deal with what has happened that most of the time you don't read about in history books. Or if you do, it's not the main focus. It's always in conjunction with something else. For instance, Thomas Jefferson and the Barbary Pirates. It may mention that the people that are like in modern day Libya, well, Libya is even in existence anymore after U.S. foreign policy, but the idea that it gets conveyed in history books is that the story centers around Thomas Jefferson using the Navy to make sure that these countries respected us. And it's only a little tiny bit that you might see about maybe a sentence dealing with the fact that, soldiers were being taken and then sold as slaves, and whatever riches were on the boat were then booty. But anyway, speaking of the Navy, though, there's a song that's often associated with Britain, and a lot of times you'll see it in association with their Navy, and that's the song Rule Britannia. Now, I'm just going to ask you this. Where do you think this comes from? Now, listen, I'm not going to sing it, believe me, so don't worry. Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. Again, rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britain never, never, never shall be slaves. Very important point there. Britain used to be a country that was raided by North Africa for slaves. That's right. Britain was actually raided. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But the thing you have to realize is this stopped once Britain created a naval force that could pretty much keep these people from coming up and inflicting whatever they were trying to inflict upon the British people. If you don't have power, there will be others who will exercise it against you. This is something you will see throughout history. American foreign policy today is a great example of it. Okay? What kept America from kind of stepping over the edge, ironically, was the Soviet Union. You had this, someone breathing down your shoulder all the time, and, us, them. But when they fell in 1991, that meant that the U.S. could pretty much do as it pleased. So power is really an issue we have to look at when it comes to slavery. Power is what, if you have it in your society, your people will not be slaves. If you have it within your society and there's maybe other people that are vulnerable, you might turn them into slaves. And that's been the case throughout history. I don't know if anyone's ever watched the movie Alexander Nevsky. If you haven't, you really, really should. If you want to get kind of a picture of the Russian character, this was a movie that was made in like 1939. Can't remember his first name, but Eisenstein made the movie. And the thing is that it talks about the military leader who, he's really revered. I've been to his memorial in Russia. And how he rose up and was able to defeat the various militaries that would come in and plunder Russia In this one, though, it was the Germans. But there's a scene in the beginning. He would turn his attention on the Tartars later. But there's a scene in the beginning in which he sees Tartars hauling off hundreds and hundreds of Russians. They're in chains. Men, women, children. And the thing is, they're going to be taken off and sold in the slave markets in the Middle East. And the thing is that he's in a conversation with one of the Tartars, and I suppose this was just the director's creativity. I don't think this actually ever happened, but Nevsky says he will take care of what the Tartars are doing to his nation once he takes care of the other immediate threats. And of course, history plays it out that he defeated the Germans and turned his attention on Tartars and so forth as well. But the thing is, if you look at history, if you actually examine, now I don't know if this is true or not. I've heard it. It might make some sense. I don't know. I admit I don't know. But the term Slav actually was derived from an older term for slave. Whether it's true or not, the Slavs were used a lot for slaves. They were raided by the Tartars. They were raided by other various militaries from the south of them, generally Islamic. And I throw Islam in there in the sense that the people that had the power was in that region. That was their religion. That's why I'm using that. But the thing is that they came in, and there would be raids that would go into Poland, go into Russia, the areas that are now Russia, other areas, and throughout the ages, we're talking like around the 13, 14, 1500s, tens of thousands of people were taken. And, when I was visiting Istanbul, we had a guide when we were going through this one museum, and they were talking about this, and they were mentioning the thing about the Janissary Corps, where the Ottomans would go into what is now like Serbia and so forth, and they would take children, young men, and they would train them, and that they would it was kind of smart. They would use other people to be in their military. But they also trusted these men that would grow up because they didn't have any genetic connections to the ruling class. So therefore, they were seen as less corruptible. But the thing is, they would just come into a village and they would just take young boys that they thought, oh, he looks like he has courage, he's strong, he's got a strong face and body, and they would take him. Okay? You get your 5-6-year-old kid taken from you by the military from the Ottomans. And that's a form of slavery. And, the guide, she was also pointing out that the sultans and many of the upper class preferred Russian or, Slavic, women for concubines and so forth. And so, there was no like explanation. It was just like that. This is what they did. And so they would go into these regions, and yes, there were, Europeans being sold in slave markets. I did read, though, that later that the most beautiful, when they go on these raids, if you found someone that was just absolutely astounding in beauty, you would have to take her to the Sultan to see if he wanted her before you could actually put her on the market. And so, he had first picks for adding to his very large number of concubines. Remember, concubine means that it's pretty much like a mistress. It's many of these sultans would have many, many, many concubines, but they were only allowed to have 4 wives. And the wives were their children had the privileges that were conferred upon by being, the genetic heirs of the sultan. Concubines, on the other hand, their children, whereas they might be put into a better position than just regular people would, they didn't have the claim that the wives' children would have. on title and so forth. So anyway, there was this check that out though. I think you can get it on YouTube, Alexander Nevsky. But the thing is that there was an individual. I ran across one of his articles from Ohio State University, and his name's Robert Davis. And I was looking at some of the things that he had pointed out. What he wanted to do was estimate, based on raids, but also, size of ships, how many people would be on a ship or something like that, how many people maybe were actually taken all together out of Europe and sold as slaves. And I think his figures were, around 1,500 to 1,800. Okay. So the thing is that he estimated that, I'm trying to look at the exact figure here, but where did I put that? Okay. Look at here. But it was over 1 million altogether. So if you're thinking, okay, so here it is. The article just says over 1 million. That's what I thought I remembered. But his estimates, again, were based, there's not like some figure that was taken by the various entities in northern Africa about how many they took. But these would not have been, for the most part, Eastern European people. This would have been Western European people. And here you were vulnerable if you were along the coastlines. There were raids that went as far as Iceland, if you can imagine that. There were cases where entire villages were taken. You might have a couple hundred people just, you've been defeated, we've captured you, we've circled your village. Get ready for an adventure of being a slave, and young women, you're going to, you know what they would do with young women. So, anyway, the thing is that this was something that really, really existed into the 1800s. And one of the first real attempts to really put it down was the United States when it went to war against the pirates. Now, at first, a lot of the Europeans, what they would do is they would pay off the governments in these regions. They would just say, "Here's some tribute. Make sure that we don't, you don't raid us." Essentially, the governments were involved in this. They'd say, "Oh, these are people we don't have anything really to do with it," but they were the ones that were actually instigating it. And so there was a situation where you'd pay a ransom or a tribute, and you wouldn't get your ships raided. And if they did get raided because you forgot to pay a ransom or a tribute, then you would pay to get your soldiers back or sailors back. And so this was something that the European powers just found that was more efficient to let the local North African government structures take care of the problem and not have to involve, going down there and taking care of it yourself. And the thing is, that kind of reminds me of what Gaddafi would do. I think he was actually getting paid by the Europeans to keep people from migrating out, using Libya as the exit point into Europe. And when he was killed by the Europeans, then you had a situation in which you couldn't stop it anymore. So that's where a lot of the migrants come in, but by boat out of Libya. But the thing is that just like the pirates used to be kept under control and not raid certain countries' ships because of tribute, Gaddafi was doing the same thing. He was just being a paid border guard, so to speak. You make me happy, I'll make sure that you don't get flooded with millions of people from Africa. And so ultimately, though, the Barbary pirates were put down as Europe became more and more advanced and actually started taking these countries over during the latter colonial periods, the British and the French especially. So you did have raids into Greece. Greece was popular. Even Syria, I found evidence that you even had like different prices for different slaves and so forth based on the what you wanted them for, where they were coming from, and so forth, their looks. For males, I really am not quite. I know that during the Crusades there was one. I remember back in my history classes in university, there was what they called a children's crusade. You remember the Crusades were the part of the reaction to there'd been many wars of conquest from the Middle East into Europe, and the Crusades were to a large degree a reaction to that. But of course, they were based on the idea that you'd get these young men usually, and you would say that if you die in the Crusades, you will go straight to heaven. If you fight in the Crusades, your sins will be forgiven. So you kind of had two different militaries fighting each other pretty, ferociously, both believing that they were fighting for God. Ironically, they're fighting for the same God. I mean, the God of Islam and the God of Christianity are ultimately the same with Jews. But they believed that they were fighting for what was right, and the Crusaders, there was one of the last Crusades. It was called the Children's Crusade, where a lot of young children. You got to remember the ideas of what children could do were different in this period of time versus nowadays, where we got to protect the kids. We got to they can't watch Tom and Jerry because it might affect them and they might become violent. But there was a children's crusade. You get young boys usually, and they were like 10, 11, 12 years old, and they went off, and they didn't really have the resources to travel across, and nor the protection, and so they wound up getting sold into slavery themselves. And so I'm not quite sure that those individuals were or weren't castrated. In Islam there is a prohibition against castration of slaves, but then sometimes you could get around that because the Ethiopians, who when they were selling black slaves, the Ethiopians of course being black, but again, the power differentiation. The Ethiopians have always been a very powerful nation. When they would sell slaves, they would often castrate them. They were not Muslim, so they didn't have a prohibition against it when they were selling. And so, and again, that I don't know if they did that to the European slaves. I'd have to look into that in more detail. But the thing is, it doesn't matter really. What really matters is the idea that during these periods of crusades, people were, some of them, wound up, instead of being crusaders, wound up being slaves. Eastern Europe, whenever these countries would push in and try dominating what is now Russia and Eastern Europe, they wouldn't necessarily go back empty-handed. They would take plenty of prisoners with them, and they would wind up on the markets. And of course, the Barbary pirates, from Tunisia and Libya, Morocco, these kinds of countries, they would take people from British Isles, along the coast of France, Italy, Spain, and yes, up into Iceland. And what I just think is fascinating is that we often just don't think about this. Now, I have seen some things on Facebook that people have sent out, talking about Irish slaves. They usually has a picture of a young naked woman crouched in a market, being bidded on. And of course, this picture is not actually supposed to depict Irish slaves, because it's depicting Romans. I mean, the girl could have been like from Britain or Germany or something like that, or any number of other areas that the Romans took over. But this was the painting itself depicts the Romans selling people as slaves. But the interesting thing is that there's been some controversy I've seen out there whether now how many, they'll usually say something like, were Irish slaves sold in America? And actually the answer I can find is no, not really. Indentured servants, yes, where you might have a situation in which someone has to pay off, like to go to America or whatever, 7 years of service in order to get their freedom. Of course, they wouldn't be getting paid during that time, and then they'd be freed. Of course, once they've got some sort of skill, like maybe being a blacksmith or something like that, then often they would just then take a job with the person who had sponsored them as an indentured servant. But the one thing that usually gets forgotten by the people who say this is not really true is they will say America. They won't talk about the Caribbean. Yeah, they'll forget about the Caribbean. And there was a time period, actually, it's depicted in a movie, it's a classic movie. Again, I think that the movies in the 30s were, regardless of where you were at, were usually probably better than today. And in this respect. And there was an old Errol Flynn movie called Captain Blood. And this was based on what was going on in Ireland in the middle 1600s. And there was a law called the Act for the Resettlement of Ireland. And yes, there were about 50,000 Irish slaves, or, essentially slaves. They were sent to the West Indies. And in this movie, it's depicted that, yes, they were put to work, maybe not in the same harsh conditions that many of the black slaves were being put through, but certainly, conditions that were far less than preferable and not necessarily as nice as the conditions they had when they were in Ireland. But the thing is, the English were really, really trying to crush the Irish. And then, of course, when they would revolt, then they, what do? You round people up and sell them down there in the West Indies. And if you really examine what the West Indies were like, it was not going down there and, sitting on the beach or something like that. The plantations there were harsh. The diseases were horrendous. The reason why they didn't use Native Americans as slaves was because the disease that the Europeans had brought in, the smallpox and stuff, had pretty much wiped those populations completely off. And whatever people survived, they got out of there. They knew how to escape into the jungles and just get away. But the thing is that white and black slaves in those regions had a horrible life. And the British, again, were not looking at it like, I'm not even really quite sure how race was seen in those days, because I've seen some evidence that really our modern racial classifications are a product of the more scientific way of looking at people and classifying them and that sort of thing. And that didn't start taking place until the late 1700s. So really it was like the British had the power. Like I said, they took over these areas, defeated their enemies, and they could do with them as they pleased. You'd see the same thing in military operations throughout history, all the way back, further back than the Egyptians, that's for sure. The whole point, there's a scripture where the prophet Isaiah has to preach 3 years naked. That's right. prophet of the God, preaching naked for 3 years. But it was to symbolize what could happen if they made political alliances. I believe it was with Egypt, although I'd have to look that one up. And what could happen to them, and that the symbolism that was involved in his warnings about don't do this is that when you would take prisoners in those days, you would strip them of clothes because you didn't want them hiding knives or something like that. And if they were naked, you knew that they wouldn't cause problems. The American servicemen in the Pacific in World War II would often do the same thing with Japanese prisoners. Before they would let them come, because they'd be afraid they might be, hiding a hand grenade or something, they would force them to strip naked when they surrendered. So, and often in those days, if you lost, you were in the salt mines or something like that until you died as a prisoner. But the point that I'm really trying to bring up here, though, ultimately, is that we need to understand that human beings really do have whether it's part of our genetic or social structure or whatever, it just seems that when one group of humans develops a power in which they can dominate over another group of humans without any kind of necessity towards compassion, they will exploit those humans just almost, and sometimes just like they exploit animals, the way we would exploit livestock. And this is something to really consider when we think about power in the world today. Whether you're thinking that, maybe human beings could try to get rid of countries and just become one big happy communal family, like Star Trek or something like that. But you often wonder, if that would happen, wouldn't that mean that power would become more centralized? And if it became more centralized, couldn't that eventually lead to something like, again, I said I was going to bring up a lot of movies, but it could lead to like a worldwide type of Hunger Games type of society, in which instead of instead of countries being able to kind of keep an eye on each other, you instead just have one system that controls everyone. That's something maybe we should consider, that slavery itself is something that I don't think it goes away once people are educated enough and enlightened enough. I think it could come back again if we allow the power that we have granted by, many European countries have principles within their constitutions, and of course the United States Constitution is a way of saying, okay, this is a protection from the government taking my rights away. But what could we see happen in the future, and as we start thinking, piece of paper, and whatever, do we really want to take the chance on human nature then coming back and biting us, as it has throughout the history of time, in which no one has been immune when it comes to slavery, exploitation, and other forms of degradation? That's something we need to think about, and not just think that, everything's we're heading to this Star Trek future that's going to be, with peace, love, and flowers. I don't necessarily think that that's going to happen if we just assume that we've come this far and we've changed as people.